about JavaScript versus Java. So it'd be hopefully this is an interesting one to a number of people. I got asked this one. I got told that this is a common problem out there, and that this is something that a lot of people would like to talk about, like to hear about. So, we'll go ahead and we'll start. I think the discussion of the difference between JavaScript and Java goes back to really back to the beginning of the web. You know, when the web first started, most of you probably don't know that HTML wasn't always the communication medium. HTTP wasn't always the protocol. One of the first protocols, probably the first, I could probably be proven wrong, but probably one of the first protocols, at least the first one I used, was called Gopher. Gopher allowed for text, links, images, and sound. Is that right? Yeah. Text, links, images, and sound. And of course, at that time, there was minimal amount of websites out there. It's not like it is now, where just about you could probably type in just about any name and some kind of website comes up. But basically, I do believe there was some form of search engines. The only thing I remember is I was in high school at that time, and so I ended up. We had time where we could go to the computer lab, and they were full of apples, and they were connected to the internet. And we went and we surfed around, blah blah blah. But Gopher was limited in what it could do. That's more than likely. That's my guess, at least. More than likely is where HTTP and HTML kind of came in. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, in case you're wondering, and HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So they're meant to work together. Basically, HTTP is meant to serve HTML, but HTTP also has a lot of its own items. Now, I'm not entirely sure what HTTP began with versus what we have now, where we have, post, patch, put, all those kinds of methods. And a lot of the stuff that we see today in the modern web is because of the advancement in HTTP and in all the stuff we use. In essence, though, the very core of web development is just a couple of things. The HTTP protocol, TCP/IP, Transfer Communication Protocol, Internet Protocol. That's what that stands for. CSS and HTML and JavaScript. Those were kind of the beginning blocks of the web. JavaScript was actually being created right around the time of Java. Basically, Java. I remember when I was in college, because I started college in 96 to 2000. And I remember right around that time, there was a lot of talk of Java. The reason I'm not entirely sure why Java was so hot, but the reason I always took it as was that it was a new language. And, there were a lot of the language we were taught in school, language that had been there for quite some time, C, C++, those types of, COBOL and those types of languages that had been around for years and years and years. I mean, yeah. So the stuff the earlier languages we were being taught were things that were pretty established, but Java was really, really brand new. And so that's why I think, at least at that time, it gained such popularity. So originally, JavaScript was named LiveScript, I believe, if I remember right. And it was created by Netscape, who nowadays goes by the name of Mozilla. So they sort of switched names and things like that, but they're basically the same company in the end. Mozilla. If any of you are JavaScript developers and you've never been to the Mozilla Developer Network, I'm wondering what's wrong with you, because they are pretty much the keeper of the keys of ECMA. That's what the standard for JavaScript is known as, the ECMA standard. Basically, it's a standard that got started by Netscape back in the mid 90s as a way to help define potential features for JavaScript and that kind of stuff. Where the need for JavaScript came in, or LiveScript that eventually became JavaScript, was the web was pretty static. It had HTML and it had HTTP. So you could go on a website, it would serve you HTML. Not really much that could happen beyond just basic static links and text. That's where CSS came in. That's where JavaScript came in. Originally, they were going to use another scripting language. I can't remember what the name of that was, but originally, before they decided to create JavaScript, there was actually another scripting language they were considering possibly moving into the browser and allowing that to be the way that we added interactivity to websites. So that was the initial thought, and then they kind of scrapped that idea and said, no, let's create our own. They wanted something that could interact with the DOM, could do certain things, stuff like that. And so basically, they kind of said, well, let's do our own, let's roll our own. They named it LiveScript. They started working on it. As they started working on it, Sun Microsystems started working on Java. So LiveScript eventually, as they started working on it and as it came closer to completion, Java was on the horizon as well. And it was gaining, like I said, it was really popular. It was gaining a lot of real popularity. And that's why even when I had to go back and do a little bit of research for this live stream, I pretty much took it that way. And so, the stuff I found when I did a little bit of research before this said the same thing. The naming of LiveScript, the renaming of LiveScript to JavaScript was completely a one about popularity. Because Java was popular, they wanted to ride the wave of Java and say, well, the popularity of Java is really going, humongous. We need to get on this wave. We need to call ourselves JavaScript. And for the longest time, I remember people thinking that JavaScript was actually the scripting language written by Sun Microsystems. They actually associated JavaScript with Java. And I don't know if any of you remember Java applets when Java first came out, but I've got a dog over here making a mess. There we go. But applets were another thing that they were considering in browser-based technology, trying to, and I even wrote one actually back in the day. At my very first job, I forget what it had to do. We had to write something. And so we said, hey, let's do an applet, because it was all the rage back then. Applets were like the bomb. They were the thing to do. So yeah, I don't remember much of what it did because it was one of my very first things I ever did. But I do remember doing it. I remember that much. I remember doing it. You got to realize this is about 24 years ago. So the amount of memory I have, the specifics of the memory I have are limited down to what I did, not really how I did or specifics of some of the things. But yeah, basically in the end, Java and applets and all that were a way they were trying to go. That's kind of the way the web was thinking. Hey, have these applications running, physically running inside of a browser. And the idea was there. You have to realize there was a lot of things during that time that kind of were coming out along that space. There were a lot of embedded things into HTML. And that seemed to be the way to get around a lot of the sticking points of HTML, at least initially. Was, HTML is pretty static. It's pretty plain as to what you could do with it. JavaScript allowed for interactivity. Honestly, I don't really remember writing much CSS at that time. I remember mostly writing JavaScript. I remember most of my interactivity. A lot of websites were using images as hover text. So you would have your images that were your individual menu items, and when you'd hover over them, you'd have another image that would be the highlighted version of that image, and so you'd have JavaScript that would switch those images out on mouse over. So as your mouse went over it, it would actually switch on and off. And you had to manually write your own interactivity on your websites. And so that was the day, at least that was the way it was back then. But that's really where the whole JavaScript Java confusion, I think, started. And it was meant to be that way by the creators of LiveScript, who wanted to hop on the Java wave and kind of ride the popularity wave and bring popularity to their language as well. I honestly, before I even did my research, I honestly thought that JavaScript was a little bit older than that. I didn't realize it was so close to Java as to when it was created. I didn't realize they were basically coming out almost at the same time. I mean, JavaScript did start a little ahead of Java, but not by much. Now, here's another thing that when I had to go in and do my research, I had forgotten about. These are things that, like I said, things come and things go. And when you hear me talk about things about technologies, how they come and go, and how a lot of things change, this is an example. So the ECMA standard, like I said, was created by Netscape. And so they wanted everyone else to follow along. When Microsoft got involved with Internet Explorer, they started off trying to, work with the ECMA standard and try to come up with a standard. And then they just said, screw it, we're going to create JScript. I completely had forgotten about JScript, but I didn't forget about this. Here's the one thing I didn't forget about with JavaScript, and that was how horrible it was to have to sit there and write a website that worked in Netscape and IE. Oh, what a nightmare. That and some other things about the web were a big part of why I almost quit web development. I kid you not. It was a nightmare. It really was, because for some things that you had to do in JavaScript, you literally had to write 2 versions of your JavaScript, and you had to check which browser was coming in. So you had to check the browser type. And if the browser type was Internet Explorer, you ran one set of code. If the browser type was Netscape, you had to run a completely different set of code, because neither of them were following each other's standards. Microsoft said, screw the standards, we're going to do our own. And Netscape says, well, we created the standard, we're going to use the standard. In the end, the standard won out. It took some time, of course, but for years there was this whole back and forth, and it for developers who had to work on the web and had to write, different versions of JavaScript, it was an absolute nightmare. And so this talk was supposed to be about JavaScript versus Java. One of the key differences is that Java is very strongly typed. And what I mean by strongly typed is that every variable has to have a type. If it's a string, it has to be typed as a string. If it's a string, it can't be changed to a different type. You have to put that, if you want to take that string and put it into something that's a number, you have to create a variable that's a number, convert it from a number, or convert from a string into a number. So you can't just, change things. Basically, you have to have a type for everything, and that type lives as that type throughout the entirety of your application. That's what it means to be strongly typed. Strongly typed means that you have a very specific type, and that type is the type for that variable for the remainder of the time it is alive within the application. On the other hand, JavaScript is what's called dynamically typed. It's also a very dynamic language in general. JavaScript has some very interesting features. I actually am planning on eventually doing a whole JavaScript teaching thing. That could take forever. Oh man, you want to talk about how many features JavaScript has, but this is one of them. And one of them is you can start a variable in JavaScript, and you can start it as a string, and then you can convert it to a number and assign it back to the same variable. You can then somehow store a Boolean in that variable if you wish to do that. And this is the same variable over and over again. Now, I would not recommend doing that. That's not a recommended way of doing things, but it does lend to certain potential features. I know I worked in an application where this was right around the early beginnings of what we would call front end, where a method got past a certain property, and then based upon what that property was, we would do certain other things. I'm not saying that was the best way of doing things. I don't think I wrote that, but it was written that way. And, sometimes you just have to work with what's there. And so yeah, that's one of the biggest difference I would say between JavaScript and Java is strongly versus dynamically typed. Another thing that JavaScript has is in most programming languages, when you define a function or a method or something like that, you define properties that gets passed to it. And then those properties, Those are the only those are the only thing that you can call that property or that function with. Excuse me. However, once again, JavaScript is dynamically typed. Technically, what you could do is you could write a function that has no parameters in it whatsoever, and yet you can still pass as many parameters as you want to. And it'll accept it. It won't throw an error. It won't tell you that you have the wrong number of parameters. It won't give you any kind of warning or anything because it allows it. Even to this day, JavaScript has an args array inside of each function. So if you're inside of a function, you can check the args array and find out how many arguments there are. You can go through and you can actually, if you wish to, you can iterate and figure out what the types of each of those arguments are. If you look at jQuery and the way jQuery does some of its stuff, that's what jQuery does. If you look at the jQuery documentation, you'll see a function there that that might have 2 or 3 different definitions, what we would call method overloading or function overloading in this case, to where you have the same function name, but you have different parameters, and different parameters supposedly are technically different functions. It's an object-oriented concept of method overloading. But in JavaScript, the way you would do that is you would provide one method, and then you would actually call different methods under the hood based upon the number of args and potentially the types of args that are passed as well. So then you could create your own overloaded method by creating a single function that then you pass as many arguments as you want to, and then the arguments determine what actually gets called behind the scenes. Not really the code-wise and writing-wise, not really the best way of doing things, but it's the one way you could get over that. Both languages do have the potential to have objects. It's just JavaScript does objects differently. Obviously, everything in Java is pretty much an object for the most part, minus possibly the startup. I don't know. It's been a while since I've been in Java, so don't beat me up over forgetting Java. I haven't done it for a long time, but yeah, basically most things in Java are classes. So it's a very object-oriented related language. It has a lot of different. I've seen some of the new additions, so there are definitely a lot of changes since I last used it. But even back then, it was still Java was all about object-oriented, and those kinds of things. Had a number of different libraries with it that came with it. Some for UI, some for accessing data, reading, writing files, and all of this stuff. Much like a framework would, or a full-fledged language would. Same kind of concept there. Basically, there was a lot of packages. So there was the core Java language, which was, I won't go into the specifics of the names, but there was the core Java language, and then there was all of the frameworks and tools that came with it that you could come along and help build your application, so you don't have to write all those things from scratch. Which is what .NET did, by the way, too, with C#. .NET and C# basically did the same thing. Anyways, so that's really where Java went. JavaScript, on the other hand, it kind of has its own version of that. It has the core language, as we know, the core pieces, the keywords, and all of those kinds of things. But it also has, nowadays we have NPM, and that's really probably the main package manager that's out there now. I'm sure there probably at one time were other ones that had pieces that you could pull, but almost everyone, Beastoff Components uses NPM. So just about everyone out there uses NPM these days. And that's kind of the concept. It's things written in JavaScript that will help you build pieces of your application without having to write it yourself. And if they've been out there long enough, then they're probably good things to use because they've probably been pretty thoroughly tested, and you don't have to worry so much about, handwriting your code and that kind of stuff. So kind of the same idea, just a little bit different. Yeah. Personally, I'd say I do like JavaScript a lot. I've been doing it. I've been working in it for quite a number of years. Did front end in it, did stuff before front end, wrote object-oriented JavaScript. That is where we're going. Yeah, object-oriented JavaScript. It's a little bit different. So object-oriented in Java is, you set up a class, you set up your internal private variables, you set up your public and private functions, and methods. Sorry, in that case, methods, and all of those kinds of things. You can do that in JavaScript as well, but it uses what's called basically it's a function. Basically, what it is JavaScript looks at a function, and if a function has other pieces, has other functions within it, then JavaScript realizes that function is actually a class, and so then you can instantiate that as a class, and then pieces come along for the ride. Then the other functions in there that are then linked to the this operator then come along as callable pieces of the prototype is what it is this is prototypical inheritance and blah blah blah, and that's kind of how the whole thing works. Like I said, I'm not going to go into it. I could talk about this forever, and I probably will if when I actually get a JavaScript teaching uh, video series out. Anyways, another big difference between JavaScript and Java is scoping. Scoping is the access that a variable has within a particular space. In object oriented, it's really easy and it makes a lot of sense. You have if you have a class, you have a privately declared variable, and this goes for just about any object oriented language. You don't have to be Java. Then that variable is only accessible within the class itself. Now, with languages like C#, they have private, protected, public. There's one more, and I'm forgetting it right now. It's been a while. There's one that makes it accessible within the namespace, but not without, but is private to the rest of the world. And I can't remember the name of that one. But yeah, public, protected. Private, only the class. Protected, any class that inherits from that class then can access that variable. Public is it's public to the world. And like I said, in C#, there's one more, and Java might have put it in their language by now as well. And for the life of me now, unless I actually open up an IDE, I'm not going to be able to remember it. But that one's an interesting one too. Like I said, it's public to the namespace that you're working within. But when you export the class outside of that namespace and use it outside of it, it's private to the rest of the world. It's a really nice feature to have, by the way. If you have a series of classes that are working with each other and you want them to be able to easily access things within your own code, but when that library, when that class gets shipped out to the users to use, they don't have access to that. So it allows you to make inner workings a little bit easier. I wish I could remember the name of it right now. Anyways, it doesn't matter that much. But yeah, that's really. But in JavaScript, what you have is the function, and then you attach other functions to this property that then makes it understand how those kind of things happen. Plus, I don't think variables, I can tell you, do not have scoping, do not have the ability to be privately scoped within JavaScript. You'll see that in TypeScript. TypeScript will actually have a private function, but if you look at the actual created JavaScript behind the scenes, what'll happen is it'll do like a double underscore. It'll make it hard to find because it won't be the same name that you created when you called it private. So if you give a private variable name, it'll have that same name, but it'll have like 2 underscores under it or something else underneath it to try to hide what the actual name is. So it's not as easy. So someone can't just say blah blah type and hit dot and find your variable. But JavaScript really doesn't have in its object inside of its objects. It doesn't really have the concept of variable hiding and that type of stuff. So basically, that's the big difference between the two. Yeah. In essence, JavaScript is that's another thing. JavaScript is compiled language. I used to be able to say that Java is a compiled language. JavaScript, it used to be interpreted, although now they have a JIT compiler. So it's compiled in the browser at right before the script is actually run. So the idea, of course, is to make it faster and make it, especially with JavaScript being used so much now, to make it as fast as possible for browsers running and all that kind of stuff. There's also different things you've got to take into account, which I guess you really have to take into account with Java too. Java, once again, is compiled. And when I say, I need to say compiled in air quotes, because technically, if I remember right, Java is compiled into a bytecode, much like C# is. C# and Java just share so much of the way they do things. It's compiled into a bytecode, and then that bytecode is what's actually executed at runtime. Now, I don't know if they still do this or not, by the way, but this is the way they used to do it. And the reason for that is when Java first came out, it came into the concept of that they were always talking about write once, run anywhere. That was like their huge selling point: write once, run anywhere. And what you could do is you could write an application and it would run on Windows, it would run on Mac, it would run on Linux, anything that had a UI that they had written, you know, something to be able to allow you to create UIs within that particular OS, it would work with. It didn't always work. It was a great idea. It didn't always work. Um, Eventually, I know they came up with their own UI in the next version of Java after the whole write once, run anywhere thing. I forget what they called it. Swing. That's what it was. It was Java Swing. And it was all right, but it kind of looked, I think they were using their own, because this is Sun Microsystems, as you remember, for Java, who no longer is in, well, I don't know if you say they're no longer in business. They got bought over by Oracle, basically. So now when you install Java, it says Oracle. Well, the Oracle didn't create it. Sun Microsystems created it. And I even remember when Sun Microsystems was still around, because when I was living in Austin, I worked for Charles Schwab, and their building was not that far away from Apple, and then just down the street from Apple was Sun Microsystems. So it hasn't been that long that Oracle bought them over, because that was only 10 years ago, maybe. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I've been here 7 years. Yeah, about 10 years ago, maybe. So somewhere in there, Oracle bought them over, and now it's called Oracle Java. But yeah. So how things change so quickly, and people don't remember where the history of things come from and all that. But that's just the way it is. In essence, let me see here. Oh, not that I can see. In essence, yeah, basically, that's kind of the differences overall. JavaScript, more for in the browser. You have to consider more with JavaScript as well. You have to think about it. I tell people all the time whenever we're writing JavaScript and they seem to think that JavaScript can do anything, I tell them, you do realize this is running on the user's machine, and we have to take into account that, the user's machine plays a big part in how fast the JavaScript's going to run. A user like with my machine that has 16 gigs of RAM, they probably do okay. But there still are machines out there that run with probably not much anymore, but there used to be not that long ago that ran with 4 gigs of RAM. I think my wife's Mac at home here has 4 gigs of RAM. I think might be 8, but I don't know. I think it's 4, because she doesn't really need all that much. She mostly uses it to go on websites, and doesn't really need a whole lot of power. But you got to consider that, because you've got to say, okay, who's the lowest common denominator here? What's the slowest machine that we're going to have? So that's considerations when you're writing JavaScript. You have to think about the end user. You can't just sit there and write poorly performant code. Yeah, because you say, oh well, what does it matter? It doesn't matter if it's a little bit slower. Well, that's fine, but as an application gets larger and larger, it does start to matter. So yeah, and that's really, I think, where the talk kind of ends, because if I'm going to go too much more, I'm probably going to get into technical differences and start talking about code level and things like that, and that could go on and on forever. But yeah, in essence, JavaScript was purposely named that to take advantage of Java's popularity at the time. Both are a C-like language. They're written very similarly. There are some differences. JavaScript is written to access the DOM. That's what makes it really, in my opinion, probably so powerful and such a great tool, because you can manipulate the DOM within JavaScript. You can do certain things, add things, take things away, all that kind of stuff. Hook up to events from within the DOM, all of those kinds of things. So yeah, it definitely has a large amount of interactivity, and it's definitely a good language to know if you're ever going to work on the web. If you're ever going to work on the web and do any kind of web work whatsoever, JavaScript is probably a language you really should know. Like I said, the confusion over Java and JavaScript was intentional, mostly a marketing ploy. But yeah, I do remember the fights between different versions of JavaScript when I was reading that. When I was doing a quick study up to try to make sure I remembered everything to talk about. It was like I think I'd purposely forgotten those times when I was sitting there fighting constantly. I was like, oh, now I remembered why I forgot that. It was horrible. It was some of the worst stuff because especially Microsoft, they always do this. They always seem to fight and try to go. I mean, I remember when Java came out, um, Java released the language for free, and they said the only thing you got to do is you can't change the way that the language works under the hood. Basically, they wanted to make sure that the middle tier, the decision logic of how to display the UI stayed intact. Well, yeah, that did make the language a little bit slower. So what did Microsoft do? Microsoft created Microsoft JavaScript, and they just tore out all the stuff that went to any other platform but their own. And so if you wrote Microsoft JavaScript, it would be faster, but it would only work on Microsoft products, only work on Windows. So if you wrote Microsoft JavaScript, you couldn't then deploy it on a Mac and have it run on a Mac because it wouldn't work, because they tore out all that middle tier work that the Java language put in place. That started, by the way, a lawsuit that then ended up in Microsoft being threatened with antitrust, with an antitrust lawsuit. That antitrust lawsuit, by the way, has been directly linked and directly said that it was the cause, and it's what became the result of the bigger tech companies you see nowadays, being Facebook, Meta, Google, Apple. I don't know if Apple really grew from that. Apple was already pretty much there, but what I say, Meta, Google, Amazon. Yeah, the really big names that are out there now probably would not have been as big had that antitrust lawsuit not been threatened against Microsoft, because they were threatened to break Microsoft up and actually, and they had done this before with only one company, and I'll bet most people don't know which company that was. And I'm not going to say, because I want you to go out there and research that yourself if you really care. But yeah, it had happened before. The US had done it before, and they were threatening with Microsoft because Microsoft was basically using the fact that they had the most popular OS and the most popular browser to basically bully other tech companies into doing what they wanted them to do. And when they threatened with that lawsuit, Microsoft backed off and kind of pulled back and let people do things. They didn't force the Internet Explorer browser on people anymore, and that sort of opened the gates for other tech companies to come in and to honestly become big, huge tech companies themselves. So now instead of one big tech company, we got about 5 big tech companies. Have we really gone anywhere? No, we just got more of them. That's all. And there have been loss. I heard threats being thrown around before, but I think that's all they ever were with those big tech companies, is threatening to do what they did with Microsoft, threatening to do what they did with the other company whose name I will not mention. So yeah, it's just so many things. But I could talk for hours about this just from reminiscing. But that's the gist of the live stream. That's the difference. That's the difference between Java and JavaScript. So I'm gonna get out of here before I spend another 5 minutes just rambling. So hopefully you guys learned